Mr. Charbit, are you ready? We're good to go? Let's do this. So, I have the honor to introduce you, sir. Mr. Charbit is a professor in political science. He's specialized on a Zionist question and political and geopolitical to Israel, but also the role of the intellectuals in public life, mostly Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Mini, and André Chouraki. His latest books were published lately. He has published a lot of books. We have Israel, The Impossible Normal State, which has been published on Kalman Levy in 2024. Israel is a Paradox, which has been published on Cavalier Bleu in 2018, and the Traversée des Utopiques Sionistes, which has been published in the ECLA in 2018. He's professor at Open University and works there since 2002 after he had studied at the University of Jerusalem and a good career at the University of Tel Aviv. We're happy to listen to you. And you have between 30 and 40 minutes in order to enlighten us. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Joël. I was eager to accept this kind invitation when you asked me to participate to the activity of the Institute, Jonathan, because I am very much involved in following the activity and the testimonies that you gather about the 7th of October, and also about the exodus of the Jewish people from the Arab world and the Maghreb. So when Joël contacted me, and you know that, Joël, since you were kind enough to tell briefly, to introduce me so kindly, using details that you have found, all sorts of things. It is true that I am a professor and I work on all kind of subject. I have some preferred subject, but I work on some subjects about which I don't pretend to be a specialist, but it's also subjects that I find sufficiently interesting to get involved in. And I think that the question of the Jewish refugees from Arab country, the exodus, and I know that there's several ways to explain the uprooting of the people. But there's a lot of subjects that I work directly with, and those are subjects that about which I've been always interested. And I think that may be the only incursion that I have had when I wrote about a court article which was published in the catalog of this exposition, and it was talked quite a bit with the exposition at the Institute of the Arab World. This was the first expedition. And after 20 years, this institution decided to have an exposition on the three religions. And of course, Judaism was included. So, and the Jews in the Orient. So it was an exposition which was, we'll say, ethnographic, like documentaries, but of course, and developed and evolved in the history, which has created a lot of controversy and debates, because this history is not a romance novel. This is history, and other people are much more equipped to talk about this history but me. For example, Bernard Lewis, who is in his book, in the first pages of his book, talk about the Jewish who are trying to live in, and then we also have Roger Herrera. So in this book of Bernard Lewis, The Jewish in Islam Countries, he talks about that the Jews in the Islam countries have never been as happy as they've ever been, even happier than they were in Europe, and have never been as unhappy as were the Jewish people in Europe. So they are super happy and super unhappy. And during the 10 and 20 years, we can see with a more serene eye what has really happened to these people in the long run. And that was a lot of ignorance on this subject. And effectively, since since this revision of the story of the Jews in Arab countries, we can see that we are more caught between a rock and a hard place. There's a lot of controversy and a lot of debates about it, like I said already. It is either everything is horrible, everything is super duper wonderful, like a romance novel. So in both cases, this is an interpretation. The truth lies somewhere in between. And and people use their ideology or their political standing in order to drain from that situation. And when we talk about the Jews in Arab countries, uh, we are tempted to talk about all the modern conflict and all the and this is a conflict that is nothing more than the continuation on the super old conflict that was written already in the Quran. This is something that has been created even before time itself. So the position, the rarest position that I am going to share with you is that generally, this is something that intellectual people use a lot, and generally, it is frequent to see that intellectuals who would be an historian would have a vision of history, which, when we talk about politics, uh, pretty much says there is a pretty much the same thing. The first one to have talked about this train of thought, which was kind of surprising, was Albert Liby. Albert Liby was talking about the condition of the Jews in Islam country, and he was the first one who was deconstruct the myth of the happy coexistence between the Jewish and the Arab people. And and he said, no, 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 this is not at all the way it was. It was not all happy go lucky. We were humiliated. We had to walk against the wall. People were insulting us. So he was the first one to debate this situation. And and he he talked about the portrait of the colonized people, which I have read in Hebrew, but he was on the political plan. Uh, he wanted to fight the reconciliation between the Jewish people and the Arabic people. It's not because because this is not something that has been a peaceful cohabitation for thousands of years. It was like that 2,000 years ago, and this is something that will continue to be. So I have given you a quick outline of what was discussed during this exposition, of which I was an elected member. And it was a scientific committee. And my role, which was to be the junction between the Israeli museum, because the museum in Israel had lent some beautiful piece of their collection to use during this exposition. So they asked me to write some articles, and one of them were about concerned the departure of the Jews from the Islam country, from the Maghreb. while trying to explain and give an idea of all the opinions and a little bit of an overview of all the theses that had been advanced and the ones that I knew about. And the thesis to which I had toward which I had an intellectual sympathy. It doesn't mean that it was a legitimacy. It simply means that this is what I was the closest to, and because I have read a lot, I have worked a lot, and when I wrote this article, I took in consideration most of the points of view. So the subjects that I have decided to breach today, and I'm going to try to not talk about it as a polemic. I will try to relate the two experiences. And I must say that the last thing, I would say one last thing about this exposition in 2021 is that following the polemic that came from me collaborating and the Jews had stolen all the heritage, and then they were squandering the heritage, blah blah blah. And I met a writer, a Lebanese writer, who died lately. I think last April. Elias Rouhi wrote Les Portes du Soleil, the Doors of the Sun, and talked about this coexistence that turned badly between the Jews and the Arab people. And he wrote an article which was seemed to be quite innovator about the question, since in this article, which he called the two versions of the Nakba. He himself assimilated the departure of the Jews from the Arab countries like the other verse of the Nakba. And he was establishing a sort of cause and effect. I don't know if this is a cause and effect, but because he is a scientific writer. But we did not want to submit him to a precise methodology. But he's the one who said in his article, he is the one that was talking about the confrontation during his existence with Palestinian who left Palestine in 47, 49, went to Lebanon. Like you know, half of the refugees came at that time, and half of them stayed in Palestine. When I say they stayed, they moved around, but they were still in Palestine. So we went from Ashkelon to Gaza. So he left his his home, but still stayed in the same country. So they still saw themselves as refugees, even though they still were in Palestine. They were insider refugees, let's say, but it's not like they went to the end of the world, but they still considered themselves as refugees, and they had to leave their hometown. So half of them went to Lebanon, the other one stayed, uh, and half of them went to Jordan or in that general area, even Syria. And this was the Nakba of 48. This is not an historical fact. This is something that was real when I met refugees, children of refugees, grandchildren of refugees. And what we say often, they have transmitted this tradition from father to son. So he had been a militant for the OLP. He was open to Fatah. He had given his time for the cause, even if it was Lebanese. He was not a Palestinian. He was not a child of refugees, but he called this the tragedy which had fed a resentment of the Arab world toward Israel. He called the tragedy, the drama, which had been committed by the Arab countries against the Jews, or or pretty much the same. And I said in that something that I thought that the Israelis are not capable of doing something like that. Uh, so we hear some talks about the Armenian Shoah, the equivalent of the Holocaust toward the Armenian people, but this is very rare. Let's talk about. Uh, he said that we have we are responsible for this drama, which we try to sweep under the rug and ignore. So this was my introduction, and let's go back to what the debate should be about. On the Israeli side, let me start about. I start by the Lebanese point of view, but I have but it's never easy to talk about history without having to explore all the options. So let's see what happened on the Israeli side. And essentially, it's all about perceptions. And but instead, events is what is truly important. So if we go back to the history between 48 and now, we can see that the Israeli perception of the exodus of the Jews from North Africa and the Maghreb has been done in successive waves, because a new Israel, a new Jew coming from Iraq, were organized in 60s and the 70s, but they were really not able to get some meaningful support. And there are several reasons for that, maybe two or three. The first reason, and maybe this is something that we can see today in outside of Israel, this is a kind of competition of the victims. Between all the tragedy that we had to live as Jews, and the Jews that Ashkenazi Jews had to suffer, that the exodus, the departure is something always traumatic, and mine was more traumatic than yours. I had to leave my home, my fatherland, my children, my friends, um, and it and and lush and in order to I'm sorry, and it wasn't easy to live through the Eichmann trial. And there is a book of George Benusian about this horrible crime and this trial. But it is clear that the Shoah is the baseline. Uh, it is, and this is very clear that this is something referred to the Shoah when they write their memoir from Tunisia, from Algeria, from Morocco. They say we have lived difficulties, we have been persecuted, and they compare that to the Shoah. So at the same time, this is the tragedy we had to live, but this is the real tragedy which lessens the drama that we had to live. The second reason, that is that culturally speaking, I'm going to speak about the condescendence of the. In fact, I can't. There's no reason to leave a lot of room for what happened a certain time in Iraq, for example, and the process would take a lot of time. before to really get to the substantial details. And then the third reason, and this happened in the years of 1950s, is that she would not, if we would not study this deal carefully, if we do not consider things, we've always, the Israeli people always wanted the Nakba. The whole debate between Palestinian and Israeli is because for the Palestinian, the Akbar is not closed. They say this is a never-ending Nakba. In the literature, I think of Abel Matna, and I'm not going to give you all the references, but they talk about a permanent Nakba, a Nakba that never ends. This has it continues by the occupation and the colonization, but aside from that, there is a traumatic period that never ends. For the Israeli, that has been what happened from 45 to 49, and then now way over it. History goes on. The verdict of history has ruled. We have 750,000, 850,000, maybe 1 million people were involved, and it's true, it happened, and that's it. The boundaries have been established, have been determined, and now we have to move on. And in this context, and I dare to say the normalization of the Nakba. And when I see normalization, it means that dissipation of the Nakba. There is or quasi vanishing of the Nakba. There is another argument that has to be made, which is the non-moral Nakba that is perpetrated by Israel. When I say a non-moral character, it means that the United Nations admits that in case of aggression, and Israel was aggressed in 1947 and 48, it admits that the punishment for this aggression, which means that the surface of Israel went from 100 to 55, and during the War of 67, nobody has told to UN that Galilee had been lost. But, oh God, the right to aggress Israel does not give the right to pursue a population that voluntarily left. But in fact, that population has been expulsed, and in this context, we have to explain why there's no way to come back. We invent an argument, a false argument. It has been talked about for forever by the new historians. We invent that some people left voluntarily because they didn't want to be involved in the war. They were afraid, so they left. Look at Ukraine or Lebanon. So they went up north. And then after the war, they go back home. But know that since July 48, in July 48, that there was a ceasefire, and all the ones that left were not allowed to come back. Ben-Gurion knew that. He knew. They say, this was a lack of balance in the equilibrium of the demographic. So what do we do in this case when we invent that the era Arab armies were saying, no, 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 no. They didn't leave voluntarily because they were afraid of the war. They just thought that it would be better to come and live with us. When you see an army invade your country, you're not going to stand in your hands. You're going to decide to do something. And they say, oh, they chose to come to us, to the country of the invading army. And we believed all that. And I think, and even 40 years later, this argument is not used as much, but this is still an argument that is used. So it's like, but that makes absolutely no sense. They left. They voluntarily left. Why? Why don't you let them come back? The answer comes from the leaders. The answer is, in fact, we kind of sort of we sort of did the same thing between the two wars, between Turkey and Greece. There are Jews in Arab country, there were Arabs in Jewish country, so we traded. Of course, it's not the way it worked, because this went over 2 decades, more or less, and the Palestinian Nakba, if you adopt once more the attitude of the never-ending Nakba, it started in 47 and went on in 49 and 50, and Israel proceeds to the evacuation of the close population, especially around Ashkelon. And there was a Arab village in that area that was moved. And then when they come with the white flag with their hands up in the air, we sometimes some of them were authorized to come back, but this is really a bureaucratic invention, which is very much loved. They were authorized to come back, but we did not allow them to take the Israeli citizenship, and and then they were just there, but not really there. They were present while being absent, and absent while being present. So, so they did not necessarily were allowed to have electricity, water, and it's only in 92 that the people who had come back in the 50s were considered, the few thousand people that came back in the 50s were considered as part of the population. So in the 50s and the 60s, if you bug us too much with the Nakba thing, we'll say, well, there's another Nakba. And the Israeli attitude is, let's see, our we are not going to compensate the Jews in the Arab country, and you don't ask us to compensate the Palestinian in Jewish lands. So that seems really simple. I don't know whether we understand the canon of fortunes that were left behind by the people who left, went to Libya or Yemen or Morocco or Egypt. And I'm sure that those fortunes were appropriated, which is a law. It is about the law of the absence presence. And there was a census in 49, and all the people who were not present in that census of 49 were losing all their stuff, all their stuff. And this is how the Israeli state, who owned 7% of the Palestine since 1949, lost the bourgeoisie and the elite, without counting the property owner who did not live in Israel or in Palestine, lost all their stuff. So in the 50s and 60s, we consider that this is a status quo. And there was a very little official support to those organizations who had to deal with the conflict, and it was very difficult for people to be compensated for the property they had left behind or the fortune they had left behind. Paradoxically, it is Oslo, from Oslo to Camp David in 93 to 2000. This is where you can see the resolution of the conflict, that things start to move, that starts things to happen. Because, without going into great details of the Treaty of Oslo, but you know that those are a declaration of principle, which is that one thing, for 5 years, we're going to be autonomous, and 2 years after this autonomy, we should be able to talk about all the subjects. No debates will be excluded, including the debate on the refugees. And we talk about the Oslo Accord, blah, blah, blah. That's been, that you have to read it. Please read it again. This is called the Declaration, Oslo Declaration. This is a text that is very, very interesting. And I'm just giving you an overview, very rapid, but even if there is something that is undeniable, those accords of Oslo completely failed. Nobody can contest that. It's completely failed, especially now that we have this war. So during those years, we thought that we were able to talk about anything, and the Nakba, and that the negotiation would be difficult, yes. And at this time, when we consider that they would be a tough negotiation, we see that the Israeli Authority are starting to go, that could be quite interesting. Wait, now we need to take care of that. And this gave birth to this evolution, which is interesting, meaning that we are going to call the catastrophe the uprooting, the big uprooting of the Jews from Maghreb and Mashrek. We give it a word and we say, that's it, it's the Nakba. So did everybody follow that? No, not really. This was very isolated, but the name of Nakba has been introduced even in Europe. Quite late, but still, between 49 and 50. But globally, nobody knows about it abroad. When I would use the word in French, in my articles in French, I would put it in italic. But now we use it because it's in the dictionary. So it's a foreign word. It belongs to the political vocabulary in French and in English and all that. So in this context, it is true that things have been talked about, and I will try to explain that more in detail for the few minutes that I have left. How far does the comparison goes? It's always easy to make a comparison and know what is the same and what is different. So I would say, I talked about it briefly, and I'm going to go super fast. But if we talk about Nakba, like I said, this is something that we don't talk about much. This is something that, at least often, during the 750,000 people that went to Jordan, and which is not an independent Palestine, but which is still Palestine. The others go to Lebanon, to Syria, to the other thing that I would like to talk about is that half of them go from one place in Palestine to another place in Palestine. And if you, like I told before, and if I want to be a bit sarcastic, like a lot of my Israeli citizens are, if you lived in Ashkelon or Ashdod and you went to Gaza, it's only 30 kilometers, for heaven's sake. So maybe you don't realize that it was a little cruel to understate this uprooting, but it's still only 30 kilometers. And it is true that those people had to leave their land, and it is true that do you have to be considered a refugee if you have to leave your village to go to another village? So yeah, I guess maybe you're a refugee because you weren't born in that village. It's like in France. Uh, if you're French and you go to Belgium, are you a refugee, even if it is 30 kilometers away? So they say, well, it changes everything because it's not your country anymore. And the second aspect, and I will say that also in order to not overload the catastrophe that was the Nakba, uh, is that for the ones that left to Jordan, in Cisjordania or into Syria or Lebanon, I can admit that they are refugees, but they are in exile since they're not on their land. But objectively, this exile has nothing to do. It cannot be compared to the exile that had to live populations. We had to to be in completely culturally different countries. Well, I'm not talking about what we did to those people, but um, uh, even though it was individually, personally very difficult to be uprooted that way, are they truly refugees? They were transplanted. They went from one Arab country to another Arab country. Okay, so it wasn't their village, the one they had before, but the dominant religion was Islam. The food was the same. It doesn't mean that it was not a personal catastrophe, but was it really the same as comparing the Jews that were that left Rome, uh, or or the European Jews that had to get out of there before the Shoah? They went from Poland to Paris. That is a bit of a cultural shock, isn't it? That's a real transplant. You have to learn another language. You have to learn another culture. So that cannot be compared. So when you say, okay, this is what happened, fine, this is what happened, they were uprooted, fine. But they still sit in their country, even if it was in the same, in a different area in their country. 30 kilometers is not an exodus. And it is true that it cannot be compared to an exodus of 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers. So, and if we talk about the competition between two national movements, I would say that it was either during defeat, they would give up, or they would just use that in order to be ready to fight another day. And they could have, potentially. They could have. Because those Arab countries, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, all those are fairly new countries. They so, but it wasn't the case. It wasn't the case for two reasons. The first one was, and 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 I say that I talk about that with my colleagues, or even in political spheres. Uh, my friend Petrimi, whom I love to death, did not agree with me on this question. But Nevertheless, if the Palestinian population is designed by the as Arabs of Palestine, which was included in the sharing of the area uh, through the Britain Treaty. In 46, we had about 1,200,000 people. After all the fights, let's say we have the ones who live in Jenin, Ramallah, Gaza, everything that is in Cisjordan, they're not refugees. They're at home. They're there. They welcome refugees. You have 156,000 people who stay in Israel. They become Israeli citizen. They are Israeli citizen, and at the same time, uh, they belong to a military administration which went on until 66. And you have about 750,000 who don't stay home, neither in Israel, neither in Gaza, and they uh, in and I've never seen such a movement of population of that sort. When we talk about the Germans that were thrown out of Poland, and the Indians in India that were thrown out of Pakistan, this it's a lot more than the population we're talking about now. But how many uh, German refugees are there compared to the German population or the Greeks or the Turkeys? How many people left Turkey in order to go to Greece and the other way around? 5%, 10%? Okay, maybe 15%. But when you're talking about 750,000 on 1 million people, it's a ton. When you have half of the Palestinian population is and this for the Israelis in 48, 49, they say, okay, I can see I see that some villages have been completely abandoned, but then again, we go 30 miles later, 30 kilometers later, and the same people are there. So they thought that it would. This is the fact that they were close to the Israeli border that made them think, hey, if we fight, we can get our property back, our goods back, we can go back home. So the Nakba is the moral foundation of the Palestinian cause. I always told to my students when I talk about them, I say, imagine the same military victory without the Palestinian exodus. They lost, get over it, boom. But no, not in this case. And Erica, you were talking about my last book, and I spent a lot of time in the United States, in France, uh, and I was not in Israel, but I hear a lot of people talking about the 7th of October, and I see a lot of them that uh, the Israel has the right to exist. And they say that they're justified to have this land of Israel, but they cannot justify 100% of they should be awarded 100% of the land. And this is a scandal. This is horrible to see that we want to take all their territory. I agree that Israel has to exist, but it cannot be while taking everything from another land. You cannot justify this this compensation, this Palestinian compensation. This ridiculous story of the Riviera, the Gaza Riviera. So you can imagine that everybody's mobilized. and the ambiguity or the complexity that we're talking about. And I'm going to have to stop in order to give you some time to answer some question. But where's the ambiguity? Yes, the Jews in North Africa and the Mashrek knew we're true refugees. Now, they was under different circumstances. In Egypt, it was they were expulsed, but more often is the intimidation. You have to understand that you are not a full-fledged citizen. And that is the big failure of the Arab nationalism that I was talking about earlier. Their anti-Zionism, if it would have been an authentic ideology, should have incite the Jews. Okay, would have they should have been convinced that their ideology was not viable, and say you don't need to go back to Israel. You want to stay right here and be happy here. But no, no, this is not the way it worked. And there is a comparison between the the national Jewish movement and the national Arab movement have the same purpose, which is to create a nationalism. And we're not talking about civic nations, about ethnicity and cultural and linguistic. The conclusion is it's better to be on the Jewish side than on the Arab side. It's like you say to a Tunisian, you're Tunisian, but you're not a real Tunisian. And this is the same thing between those two movements. And Mimi talks about the drunkenness of the new nations. They're intolerant, they're turbulent, and they do not want to give up the idea to put their hands on all the goods that the refugees came with or left behind. Why the FLN is going to say, "Oh, but you're my brothers. You're our brother. You were here. We had when we know that the departure of the Jewish Algerian population allowed the country to take the goods and the fortune of the people who had left." And this is exactly the same thing that inspires Israel today. And we of course there is the democracy that comes in play here. We need to have everybody vote with a majority, and you have about 75 to 80% of the population that is Jewish, uh, and there is still an immigration that allows to compensate for the low birth rates. Um, because the birth rate of a Muslim woman in Israel has almost 4 children, which is higher. Sorry, one last thing. I know because we won't have time to have question. I'm sorry, but if the departure is identical to the ones of any refugees, when you arrive to Israel, it's not the same thing because it's a refugee with his experience as a refugee. He left everything, but he's the one that he's come back home, and he he will be more like a German that was forced to leave Poland and go back to Germany, or leave Egypt and goes to Israel. So it's more going back home rather than being a true refugee. And this is where I'm going to have to stop. Otherwise, we won't have time for questions. Thank you. Can I ask you a question? Because I got to go because I have a conference that is going to start really soon. Thank you very much. It was terrific. But there's something I did not agree with you about being Judeocentrist. For a Greek to see the departure of over 1 million Greek from Turkey. They didn't leave. They left Greece. And they were 27% of the population. In 2000, in 1920, they were a large part of the population. Istanbul is a Greek word. So you cannot minimize this. I am not minimizing this. That's all I wanted to say. But I've learned an awful lot of things, and it was very, very fascinating, and you're very intelligent. I never thought otherwise. But I gotta go. But I am very much enriched by all your knowledge and your wisdom. And it was a very animated debate, I can tell. Is there questions in the chat, or what's going on? But go ahead and put your question in the chat. If you don't want us to see you or to hear you, you can write your question in the chat. This is perfectly fine. There is somebody that is reading the chat. Usually, I'm always yapping, but I'm going to put myself in the back and wait for the participants ask their question. But if there's no question, I will ask mine. So in this case, you never know whether everybody agree with you or if everybody hates your guts. You just never know. No, I think people are shy. They're just shy. Oh, I'm not afraid of shy people. I did my point was not to intimidate you. I have a question though. I'm trying. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to ask my question. Thank you very much. I missed the first few minutes. It was terrific. I have a question, and I did not hear if you talked about the role of the UNRWA. I think they played a very important role in order to avoid the integration of the 350,000 people who were in the neighboring countries, and they did not have the possibility to integrate themselves. So you said some new things, but we forced them to stay from generation to generation. They had to stay as refugees. I had intended to talk about UNRWA, but that was too long and I spoke too much, and I was not able to talk about everything. But the UNRWA, it's true that in a way, I spoke about 750,000 people out of 1,200,000. That more than half of the Palestinian population had to go. But when we talk about the refugee, the German refugee, the Greek refugee, the Turk refugee, those are Greece who went back to Greece. They go back home. They go in their state, back to their state. And I think that we're not going to do guesswork in history, but you have to understand that there is no Palestinian state that is able to welcome all those refugees. And that would have changed everything. But this is not, we consider that to want them to integrate in Lebanon, it's impossible because they lack human rights, and know that, and it doesn't mean that after 75 years it should still be the same. When you think about it, I don't understand why you would keep them from being architects. It's under to feed the resentment and revenge. But we consider that if we do not resolve this problem politically, then you play in Israel's hand. If they integrate themselves in the population, who would have won then? Who would have won? They would have left their country. They go to another country. They have a house. They have a this. They have a that. They have education for their children, yes. But who politically was the big winner? It would have been Israel, obviously. And we go back to this idea that to say, you you deserve this and that. In 1947, the the deal was to create two states. Even after the Shoah, oh, it never was said Israel has to take everything. No. And it's the same debate today. How, independently from the current circumstances. But the debate is still there. So UNRWA, of course, was there. But there is one thing that doesn't work. The first one is UNRWA built schools, uh, hospitals, temporary lodging. And it has helped and partially resolved the problem that the Lebanese did not want to solve, the Jordan people did not want to solve, or the Syrian people didn't want to deal with. Because there is a political problem. And this political problem cannot be resolved by saying, oh, we are going to play in Israel's hand. So this is what I have to say. So I want to talk about the transmission. The transmission doesn't change much of anything. We transmit the facts, and and I would say, to be a little tough, that I am particularly tough when we're talking about Jews who use this argument, or Israeli that use this argument, because we have been considered as refugees for 2,000 years. So they cannot claim to be more refugees than we are, because we have been refugees historically. Because wherever we are, in Belgium, in France, or whatever, we are always in a temporary home. So why would you allow a population to do something and not the other? So this is not an argument that I adopt readily. But I can say that in Lebanon, you can prefer, you prefer being a refugee and be able to have medical cares or whatever, rather than being somebody who comes from the nowhere. Excuse me, but I am I'm terribly sorry, but we have to stop. We have to stop. Oh, here's my son. Is the groom. He's coming today. Oh, he's adorable. So if you have questions, send them to me directly by email, and I will answer to them. I'll be happy to, and later we can have a debate without you. So write an email to the institution attest, and I will forward them to Professor Charbit if you have something that you would like to talk about. Thank you very much. It was super interesting. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.